Thank y'all for having me. Dr. Catchot, I grew up the son of a large animal veterinarian, and I'm married to one, and I certainly understand the need for that out in the country. My dad's 74 years old and still practicing, and there's a lot of folks that say when he's gone, what are we going to do in that part of the world? So glad to hear y'all are working on that over here. I'm going to talk to you today. I'm probably going to scare you to death with some of the numbers I'm going to throw up here at you, but I think you've got a sheet, maybe a copy of my slides you can follow along with. Before we get started, I certainly do not claim to be a baleage specialist or pro. I have been putting up baleage on my cattle operation in southeast Alabama since 2014, and I can tell you a lot of things not to do. But of all the things that we do, I do think that fertility, soil fertility is probably most important in terms of being able to ensure whether we're successful or not continually. I do get to speak at a baleage workshop in southeast Alabama every March, and I always talk about variety selection in that particular meeting, and so this is a little bit different, but I think it's important. And it was a good exercise for me to actually get to study a little bit for this particular slideshow. So one thing I want to focus on for baleage, I know in the part of the world that I live in, there's a fair amount of Bermuda grass put up for baleage. Some Bahia grass, not near as much. But if you're really going to be successful in baleage, and I think Dr. Rushing is probably going to talk about this in a little while, I think you need to kind of focus on annual forages. Almost kind of thinking of it from a silage standpoint. The reason for that, especially in our annual grasses, you just have a lot more water-soluble carbohydrates in those forages, and so that lends itself to drive that fermentation process a lot better. And there's quite a few of those that we use. I would say that the one that is used most often would be ryegrass in this part of the world. Where I live is probably more oat-based, actually. Moving more towards ryegrass, and some guys will mix ryegrass and oats together, but we also do a lot of summer annual forages, and that would be sorghum Sudans and millet, some crabgrass as well. So as far as soil fertility goes, and I know that we want to hit on how that affects the quality of the forage that you produce. But it also not only affects that, but it affects the subsequent crop, whether it's another forage crop or in the part of the world I live in, we are so heavy row crop, we have to think about the cotton or the peanuts or the corn that might come in behind this particular annual crop, and we certainly do not want to starve those crops because we're taking off especially so much potash. So the most important factors in fertility, number one, soil pH. A lot of this stuff will be not new to you. It'll just be a refresher. But without having a proper soil pH, our nitrogen, phosphorus, potash, sulfur, those things are not nearly as available as we need them to be. And when fertilizer costs what it costs, we want to be as efficient as possible. So nitrogen, all of us know that nitrogen stimulates growth and increases crude protein content in forages, especially grasses. And we tend to get just tied up on nitrogen, but nitrogen's not the only thing. Phosphorus is essential for a lot of the processes that go on in the plant, and especially from a seedling vigor standpoint, we need to make sure that we're in good shape on phosphorus. But potash, I cannot stress potassium enough, especially in grasses. It's as equally important as nitrogen. It is the one that I consistently, especially in Bermuda grass, and I have the blessing or the curse of looking at about 75,000 acres of Bermuda grass every year in my territory, and I don't even like Bermuda grass, but I have that much of it I have to look at. And potash is the number one causative agent for decline in Bermuda grass stands. But we see that same problem in a lot of these annual forages that are put up for baleage too. But we need to focus on potash. Calcium stimulates root and leaf development, forms compounds in the cell wall, part of the plant structure. Magnesium very important to chlorophyll molecule, and then sulfur supports the development of plant enzymes and vitamins and is necessary for chlorophyll formation. What's interesting about that is I don't think, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, that you will find sulfur in chlorophyll, but it is absolutely necessary for chlorophyll formation. Focusing on potash, just to kind of keep hitting this drum. Potassium is vital for photosynthesis and protein synthesis. It strengthens the plant, and it's like a lot of people like to call it the vaccine of the plant, because it does help the plant's immune system to fight off diseases. It is extremely important in activating a lot of different enzymatic systems. Carbohydrate synthesis and transfer is there. And one of the big things that we see constantly is crops that are deficient in potash tend to be less tolerant of drought. So we see a lot of stand loss there too. Y'all probably seen this quite a bit. This chart floats around all over the country. The main thing to focus on is the box kind of in the middle, and that's where we want to be on soil pH. It's between a 6 and a 7, or a 6.2 and a 7.3. And in this part of the world, this is very similar to where I live in southeast Alabama. This becomes a little bit more difficult because we have such a naturally acidic, sandy soils. And so back to that earlier slide of pH being extremely important, you see that nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, calcium, all of those are most available in those in that range. I will point this out, it's not totally important to what we're talking about today, but I get this question so much, even in this part of the world, this time of year. Why is my Bahia grass yellow? And you see it in the spring, or you may see spots in your Bahia grass pastures. Bahia grass has a high affinity for iron. And iron, as you can see, is one of those soil nutrients that's more available at a much lower pH, like down around a 4. Well, we certainly don't want to be there. So you've got this rapid above ground tissue development in that Bahia grass going on right now because it's warm during the day, but it's cool at night, and our soil temps haven't picked up enough yet. And so with Bahia grass having that affinity for iron, it's not really good at sequestering that iron from the soil. And we can actually exacerbate or make that problem a little bit worse by pushing it too early with nitrogen, because that just encourages more leaf development and growth above ground. And the other thing we'll see is if we get that pH too high in Bahia grass and then push it with iron, we see a lot more chlorosis. Just a side note, I get a lot of questions about that. Just something to think about. So I put this slide in the other night thinking soil fertility is hugely important, and we can do all those things right. But if I don't harvest at the right time, and I'm sure Dr. Rushing is going to talk about this too, that all kind of becomes a null point. So these were some actually hand samples that I took a couple of years ago as we were getting ready to harvest a baleage trial. And so you'll notice, I don't know if you can see it really well, but the moistures are really high, higher than you would necessarily want in a baleage crop. So you got this first one, this Elbon rye, you're at about 80% moisture, and you're about 72% moisture on the cossack oats and the ryegrass. My point here is Elbon rye is a very late maturing rye, especially compared to Renza Bruzzi. And it's even later maturing than these cossack oats, or at least in this particular trial, because these were planted on the same day. But look at crude protein, and this is Elbon rye and ryegrass mixed, cossack oats and ryegrass mixed. And just looking at crude protein, we're at 24% on the Elbon rye, and we've dropped down to 11.5% on the cossack oats, and that's all due to maturity. This had gotten too mature. That was probably not quite mature enough really to be able to take advantage of total yield. But point is, You can do everything right from a fertility standpoint, but if you don't get it harvested at the right time, it doesn't matter. So this is where it gets kind of convoluted and gets scary for a lot of people. But N, P, and K removal, and everything I'm going to show you here is International Plant Nutrition Institute numbers. Mississippi State may have slightly different numbers. Auburn would have different numbers. Georgia, Florida. I have found in my career that the IP&I, especially with the high-yielding plants that hybrids that we have today, the IP&I numbers actually seem to be a little bit more correct, and I'll tell you why I believe that in a minute. But I'm showing nitrogen. P is P2O5 and K is K2O. So, what happened? There we go. This is per ton of dry matter removed, okay? So we're putting up baleage, which is high moisture hay, but these numbers are based on a per ton of dry matter removed basis. So ryegrass is easy to remember. For every ton of dry matter, it's 43 units of nitrogen, 12 units of phosphorus, 12 units of K2O, or 43 units of K2O. So it's a 1-to-1 ratio. Small grains are similar from a baleage standpoint or a hay standpoint to ryegrass, maybe slightly lower, but not much. Bermuda grass, 46N, 12P, 50K. So I want to point something out here. This is where I believe the IP&I numbers are the most correct. I don't think I know of any university data that will show K2O that high in removal as IP&I. But every time we look at this, we're using these numbers with our growers, and we're trying to put back 50 units of K2O for every ton of dry matter, and we are not increasing soil levels of potassium. So what that tells me is that this might actually even be lower than it should be. So it's easy to figure. And 50K, I'll ask a Bermuda grass hay grower, what's your yield goal? And if I ask 10 of them, 3 or 4 of them will know right off the bat. And they're usually horse hay guys. 3 or 4 of them will look at me like I got 3 heads. And 3 or 4 of them will say, well, I make this many bales, they weigh this much. My moisture is usually running around 12%. So we can figure this out. But the answer always ranges somewhere between 5 tons per season and 8 tons per season. 8 tons is high. That's going to be the horse hay guys. They're really pushing that yield, trying to push quality. 5 to 6 tons is more for cow guys, seems to be more appropriate or more average. Well, if 50 units for every ton of dry matter and we're removing 8 tons, that's 400 units of K2O. And that's why we see so much decline in Bermuda grass hay fields in the southeastern United States, is because you're not putting it back, because it's so expensive. But if you don't put it back, you start to see stand loss, yield loss. Sorghum Sudan, one we'll talk about here in a minute, 30N, 10P, 34K. This one's interesting, pearl millet. Can't really find a whole lot of information on this to be very accurate. So we're using pearl millet straw for this particular situation. We think that the K might actually be a little bit higher than this. But one thing I want to point out about pearl millet and sorghum Sudan, and we'll talk about this a little bit more, those two summer annuals are extremely good at scavenging soil nutrients, especially nitrogen. But pearl millet's better than sorghum Sudan at scavenging nitrogen. And the reason for that is because it has such a fibrous root system. So we have to be really careful with how we apply nitrogen to these crops, especially pearl millet, or we'll get nitrogen accumulation, nitrate accumulation, nitrate toxicity. And we see it somewhere from year to year. Alfalfa removes a lot of nitrogen, but the cool thing about alfalfa and other legumes is that they produce their own, so we don't have to put that back. The other thing that you might see here that's kind of a trend is that you can most of the time think about. Phosphorus is pretty consistent across grasses. Most of the time it's in that 12 range. Again, pearl millet's a little bit low, but we don't know if that's exactly right either. So you can always kind of think about your phosphorus removal being around 12 units per ton of dry matter. Fescue, I know y'all can't grow that down here, but I had it in case I need to do this again. So these are the fertilizer sources that we're all most familiar with. Ammonium nitrate, urea, DAP is diammonium phosphate, MAP is monoammonium phosphate. Y'all probably don't use much MAP over here, but in Georgia, southwest Georgia where I work a lot, they use more MAP than they do DAP. So MAP is higher in phosphorus but lower in nitrogen. Ammonium sulfate, muriate of potash, you just know is potash fertilizer. K-Mag I think is the coolest and best single fertilizer ingredient that we have available to us as forage producers. UAN, these are your liquids. One with sulfur, 28005 and a 3200. Some people blend those. So I don't want you to get caught up in this busy slide and all these colors and numbers. This is just a ryegrass baleage trial that we just finished last month in Georgia, southwest Georgia. And we look at it from a raw yield per acre standpoint. So that's actually just the raw tonnage, pounds per acre that we take off of those strips. And then we look at it at 60% moisture because that's where we want to be from a baleage standpoint. And the average moisture here in this particular trial on the day of baling and wrapping was 62.5%. So we were right where we wanted to be. And then we look at dry matter yield per acre because a cow's diet is based off of dry matter intake. And then our nutrient removal is based off of dry matter removal. So if you look at, we're going to use the high one, where we averaged on dry matter yield, we averaged just over 2 tons per acre on this particular harvest. And this is a single harvest in southwest Georgia. It's really sandy. It's really hot, really quick, much like here. This particular spot was going back into peanuts. It was a single cut deal. We could have gotten another cutting, but we chose not to do that. So we're at 2 tons per acre on average, a little better than that on dry matter, but 11,000 pounds per acre at 60% moisture. So let's calculate how much we removed. And this is where this gets kind of convoluted, kind of scary at times in terms of how much it costs to do these kinds of things. And we were guessing when we fertilized this crop at how much we were going to remove or what our yields were going to be. And so we're looking at it in retrospect now because we know. So we're going to use the high entry here. And so it was 5,492 pounds basically of dry matter per acre. So we divide that by 2,000, 2.745 tons per acre. Well, we know that ryegrass removes 43 units of nitrogen. So multiply that, that's 118 units of nitrogen. 12 units of phosphorus is 33 units of P2O5. And again, equal 1-to-1 ratio with potash. Well, we actually applied 120 units of nitrogen and 120 units of potash to this crop in season because we knew that it was a 1-to-1 ratio and we knew that that's what it was going to take to make the kind of yields that we needed to make. I don't think we put enough phosphorus out though. I've got to go back and look and see where we were on that, but that was a 50 unit nitrogen, 50 unit potash about 3 weeks after it emerged, and then another 70 units kind of middle of the way. So I'm not going to get into prices and what all that costs. Y'all can figure all that out for yourselves, but these are real numbers. That ain't fake. That's what it takes. So this is how you would kind of figure on this if we're looking at this just solely on nitrogen or solely on potash or solely on phosphorus. So if you're just using urea, and you notice I say properly treated urea, if it ain't properly treated, you're losing, especially in this part of the world, this close to the coast, with high humidity and a lot of wind, you could easily lose 30% of your urea if you're not treating it. You could lose more than that, depending on your soil pH and soil moisture. So that's why I put that up there. But it would take 257 pounds per acre of urea to get to that, properly treated, to get to that 118. Ammonium nitrate would take more. Untreated urea, I just figured in that you lost 30%, so that's what it would take if you really want to hit those numbers. Muriate of potash and DAP. So we could use MAP instead of DAP. So now how do I figure how much of that I'm going to put out? Because that's a lot of fertilizer, and we're not going to do all that at one time. So I know that I want to use 50 pounds per acre of K-Mag, so I'm always going to work off the lower amount first. And the reason I want to use K-Mag is I get that magnesium that I need for these plants, and I am a firm believer that the quality of sulfur is much better in K-Mag than it is in ammonium sulfate. Plus I get a little bit of potassium. So I'm going to use K-Mag a lot of times in my forage fertility programs. And I need 70 pounds per acre of DAP, so I've got that figured out. So 230 pounds per acre of urea, 180 pounds of, I'm going to use muriate of potash here. So that's a total of 530 pounds per acre of fertilizer. You ain't going to put all that out at one time, I hope. You're certainly not going to do that in Bermuda grass, because Bermuda grass is a luxury consumer. Ryegrass maybe not so much, but to some degree it is. So we're not going to put all this out at one time. So we got several options to think about how we want to do this. I could split apply at the front and the middle of the growing season with half and half of this. That's a great option. Or I could split apply my nitrogen and then apply all of my P and K and sulfur up front. The danger in that with me is, especially in sandy soils where we have high rainfall, I would worry about losing some of my potassium in that situation. I would worry about it leaching out if I put it all out up front. Phosphorus doesn't leach bad, so I wouldn't be too worried about that. Or I can apply all of my P and half of my N, K, and S up front and then split the rest of it in the middle of the season. There's several ways to get at that, but the decision that you make should be based on your soil type, your growing conditions, and your ability to get it done in a timely manner. So let's go through one more exercise here. This is an actual grower that I have in Northeast Alabama, and he uses a photoperiod sensitive BMR sorghum Sudan every year, the same variety. I love that variety, but I can't use it down here because it doesn't like sandy soils. It's more anthracnose susceptible, and it has no sugarcane aphid tolerance. So I can't put it anywhere where I have those problems. But in the intermountain Northeast Alabama, where it's cool at night and heavy clay soils, or really, really loamy soils, it works really well. And because it's photoperiod sensitive, which means that as long as there's 12 hours and 20 minutes of daylight, it stays vegetative and does not go reproductive, has a lot of yield potential, and I can get 2 really good cuttings out of it. And so this is what he is averaging, is 11,000 pounds per acre of dry matter, but he's doing that twice a season. So that's 5.5 tons of dry matter per acre times 2. We know that sorghum Sudan is a 30-10, 34. So these are the numbers that we come up with. I did highlight the sulfur deal, and I want to talk about this just briefly in sorghum Sudans and millets. Where we typically apply 10 units of sulfur for every 100 units of nitrogen in most crops, I will double or triple sulfur in these crops, because that sulfur will kind of force those plants to utilize or synthesize more of that nitrogen for protein. It's not a fail-safe, but it's a good way to mitigate potential nitrate accumulation and toxicity, and it works more times than not. So these are just the numbers of how much potassium he's taken off per cutting, and he is diligent about putting that back. And I think part of the reason that he's diligent about that is they're corn farmers, they're grain farmers. They have more of a row crop mindset. They realize the ramifications of not putting that back, and sometimes in animal agriculture we don't think that way, but it's real, and that's why he continues to make these kinds of yields. So I'm about done, but I do want to hit on a couple of misconceptions and then open it up for you to ask any questions. Hybrid pearl millet, this is kind of getting off of all those numbers now. Hybrid pearl millet is safer than sorghum Sudan hybrids because of nitrate toxicity. Big misconception. Millets are, and I've already hit on this, they're better scavengers of soil nutrients, so it's easier to accumulate especially nitrates in hybrid pearl millet than it is sorghum Sudan. Sorghum Sudan hybrids are too dangerous because of prussic acid poisoning. How many of you in here know for 100% fact that you have seen a cow die from prussic acid poisoning? Don't be scared if you know. Every time I ask that question, that's the response I get. Usually no more than 1 or 2 people in the crowd know for sure. It's an overdone deal. We talk about it too much. It's not as big a problem as it's made out to be, but there are some common sense things that we can do. Don't graze or cut these sorghum hybrids until they're at least 15, 18 inches tall, because there is more prussic acid in that plant at a young age. It's a protection mechanism. Don't allow empty or hungry cattle to eat too much sorghum, right? If they're coming out of the gate and they're empty, don't let them fill up. You need to have them kind of full before you turn them in on it. And don't feed sorghum for at least 7 days after a frost. That's not really even applicable down here, but occasionally it could happen. But it will gas off after 5 to 7 days, and it's safe to feed. But the biggest misconception of all is that I can make a good baleage or a silage or a good hay crop by just throwing out some nitrogen and some sulfur. I'll worry about phosphorus and potash later when it's cheaper. You're going to pay for it whether you use it or not. You're going to pay for it in losses of yield. You're going to pay for it either in losses of yield in this crop or the next one or the next one. You might get by on phosphorus if you have really good soil phosphorus levels. And I like to look at soil fertility as kind of a savings account. So if we're in really good shape on phosphorus, and that being the most expensive nutrient that we have to purchase, then let's draw on that savings account that we got in the bank for a little while. And not draw on it too much that we get it in a low situation, but we want to at least keep it in the medium range. But potash, you're not going to get by with that very long, especially in these soils. So just to clarify this last statement, every soil lab's going to be a little bit different on what they clarify as medium or high or extremely high or low. And I don't want to get into all that minutia, but try to stay in the medium range. And after doing this for as long as I've been doing it, I'm a firm believer that it is almost impossible to build fertility in a hayfield, whether that be a Bermuda grass hayfield or a Bahia grass hayfield or a spot that we've set aside to grow baleage on, because we're removing so much. And you think about it, guy's growing a cotton crop, he's removing lint. That's about it. Now, it takes a lot of fertilizer to make a really good cotton crop, but he's not removing all that biomass in that plant. He's removing lint, a few burrs. In a hay crop or a baleage crop or a silage crop, you're taking everything off multiple times. And if you don't put it back, it doesn't just magically reoccur. you have to put it back. One last thing before I open it up for questions is always get questions on poultry litter. It's a great thing. I'd probably get in trouble if I was telling you that in front of the head shed in Decatur, but I utilize poultry litter, and you should if you can, but you cannot rely on it for the entire nutritional sustenance of your crop. Dr. Rishi Prasad at Auburn, who's a phosphate specialist, just got through with a 2 or 3 year study looking at some things in poultry litter we didn't really understand. And it's kind of opened our eyes, and that is how we receive the nutrients that are in broiler litter: nitrogen, phosphorus, potash. And it's all dependent on soil type for phosphorus and potassium. But in most broiler litters, you're going to get about 30% of whatever the nitrogen content would test at in that litter. So let's just assume that it's a 222. Some of it may be a 444. We do see the phosphorus levels in poultry litter beginning to decline. We think that's because of the environmental pressure that the poultry integrators are receiving from the environmentalists to drop phosphorus. So the phosphorus number does continue to get a little bit smaller, but a 222 is probably a good average. So if you apply 2 tons per acre of a 222, that ought to be 80, 80, 80. Well, you're only getting 30% of that nitrogen, and you're getting that in 30 days. So that's 24 units of nitrogen. That ain't enough nitrogen to grow a hay crop or a baleage crop. Depending on your soil type, the sandier you are, the faster you get that phosphorus and the faster you get that K. So down here, you're going to get about 50% of your phosphorus in about 30 days, and then the rest of it over a year. Potash, you're going to get about the same amount. So those are some neat things that we've just recently learned on how to manage that poultry litter fertility. That's all I got, unless y'all have any questions. I think I scared them to death, or bored them to death, one or the other.
Talk to us about that lime substitute. I say it's a lime substitute.
Liquid lime?
No, it's a granular product they're carrying over here.
Is it the pelletized lime? It's not a lime substitute. It's a true lime product. It has a finer, it's a finer ground product, has a higher relative neutralizing value, so it takes a little bit less of it per acre as compared to most ag limes, but it's more expensive. And so you got to kind of do those calculations. The cool thing about pelletized lime is you can mix things with it where you can't mix with just a straight ag lime. But it's a true lime product.
How much less?
It's going to depend on the soil type, but I would say on average 20 to 30% less of it than and every load of lime ain't created equal either. So, but just kind of an average 20 to 30%. And I don't know, I don't even keep up with those prices, so I don't know how that figures on a cost per acre basis.
I was told that it takes 300 pounds to equal 1 ton of lime.
I think it's higher than that.
That's what I was told by the fertilizer dealer. And that it would cost $54 an acre to put that 300 pounds out.
I need to check on that. I think it's higher than that.
Yeah, that's just what I was.
Now, one thing that's neat that we've done in Tennessee with pelletized lime is they have actually used pelletized lime to incorporate gray zone or Duracor. And so we've been able to meet a soil nutrient need without putting out fertilizer there. We hadn't done that anywhere else, but it works. So I'll check on that. I'm glad you brought that up. Yes, sir.
How long does it take this lime to be in full effect?
Again, it depends on the relative neutralizing value. And if you look, especially on that pelletized lime, because a lot of times it comes in 50-pound bags, it'll show you on the back of the bag a number based on a screen. And that kind of shows you how fine it is. But the finer that product is, the quicker it reacts. And what we found in some of our tests, because there's a guy in North Alabama David Daly, he sells premium ag lime. Not only does his lime, because it's finer, it reacts quicker, much quicker than regular ag lime, but it holds that pH a little bit longer. But one thing to think about in a pasture situation is you're not typically incorporating that lime. You're not disking it in. So it does take longer in a pasture situation than it would in a row crop situation where you're able to incorporate it. And this is just me personally. I don't ever try to put out more than 1.5 tons per acre at the time, even if it calls for more than that, because in a pasture situation, it's sitting on top of the ground, and we get a big flash flood, and we wash a bunch of that down in the ditch before it's had time to react with the soil. So 6 months is kind of what we figure that it takes to get full reactivity out of ag lime. I think with some of your more premium products, it's more like 3 to 4 months. Any other questions?
On dedicated hay fields used over and over, what's your take on pasture renovation?
Like soil renovation, like
Renovating the fields.
I think that it helps. There is so much information out there that one university will say it doesn't do anything, one says that it does. The one thing that I have seen that seems to be consistently good, especially in Bermuda grass hayfields where you've had so much tractor traffic and truck traffic year in and year out, there are soil compaction issues. And Brad Meyer, my boss, he carries a soil penetrometer around with him everywhere he goes. And so we ran into this in North Alabama with a guy, and when you hit 300 PSI, that's when root growth stops. And so the neat thing that we found in this particular situation was that we actually had better potash or higher potash levels where we had the soil compaction than we did where we didn't have soil compaction. What that told us was the root system wasn't able to, it wasn't active enough, or it was too impeded by soil compaction to be able to utilize that potash. So deep tillage, not a knife or a punch type aerator, something like a subsoiler, a Hay King that has the coulter on the front to slice in front of that small subsoiler. Those seem to be the best. I think time of the year that you do that is important too, because any kind of tillage with traffic following it just creates more soil compaction. So I like to do that in the fall after my last cutting, and then let those winter rains infiltrate that trench, if you will, and have time to seal back up. The best soil aerator that I have ever seen in Bermuda grass and Bahia grass, and we don't typically have soil compaction in Bahia grass like we do Bermuda because it has a deeper root system, is a ripper roller, but it takes a big tractor to pull it. And in the part of the world that I live in, where we have so many peanuts grown and so many cattle turned out on winter pasture on oats or ryegrass that's going to go back in peanuts, they're going to run a ripper roller over that because those cattle pack that top layer so hard. But that big roller on the back of that subsoiler just levels all that back down in a hayfield, and it works great. So I don't think that spike type aeration or knife type, I'm not saying that it's not good, but I don't think it achieves the goal that we need to achieve in a lot of situations. Thank y'all. I appreciate it.